Hey guys, welcome to the Black Girl Tech Club. I am Dream Chaser Jazz, and today we are building a weather app that pulls real-time data from an external API. So we'll be using the Open Weather API for this project, and we'll cover everything from requesting the weather info to displaying it in a simple, user-friendly interface. If you're excited to see how it all comes together, grab your code editor and let's jump right in.
All right, guys, so first things first, let's open up Visual Studio and start our new project. This will be an MVC web app. So I'll just search for MVC, make sure it's a C# version, name my application, and I want it to change the directory on this one. Just want to make sure it's saved in the correct place. So there we go, and now let's save. Let's click next and create. All right, and now our project is all set up. Let's expand these folders here. Start with our program file. So we'll have to make some adjustments there. But let's start by adding our services folder. Since this is an API, we'll need to do some additional work. We'll rename this folder here. Just make sure we have our directories correct. Let's jump over to the program file. And so because this is an API, we'll need to add MVC services. And we will also need to register an HTTP client as well as our weather service once it's created. So we'll start by adding the HTTP client. Make sure we do fix our typo there. Now let's go over and add our weather API service. So we added our weather service object. Now let's register it, builder.services.add scope. And we'll add in the name of our service here. Make sure we make this name correction perfect. Get rid of this extra space. So the 4 steps to working with an API is, of course, adding the MVC services, registering your HTTP client, as well as whatever service you're creating. Okay, so this is the Open Weather API. This is the API that we'll be using. Basically, you make your API call and it responds just kind of with like the up-to-date weather information based on the location passed in. So let's just take a look at some of this API documentation here. So we will be using the One Weather API. This is how we make the call here. These are some required parameters. And so as you can see with those required parameters, this API actually expects latitude and longitude. So we'll have to pass in latitude and longitude to get the weather for a particular area. This is an example of an API response here. So I don't know about you, but I don't know specific latitude and longitudes for cities. So what we'll be using is the geocoding API, and we'll use it as sort of like a middleman API. This is an example of how to make an API call to the geocoding API. So with the geocoding API, basically what we can do is pass in the city, the state, and it will return the latitude and longitude for the city or the location that we pass in. And then we can take that latitude and longitude and pass it into the one call API 3.0, which is the weather API, to return the weather. So again, we're basically using the geocoding API to get the latitude and longitude for a city name, and then we're using that latitude and longitude to pass it into the weather API to get the weather. So let's start by creating a data model called coordinates. So we'll give it a field called name. Give it a field called country, just in case we want to take a look at different countries. We'll need one called state. Okay, and these are actually going to be the output values we expect from the geocoding API. The input that we expect for the geocoding API is going to be the input we expect for the weather model is going to be the latitude and longitude. And it should output the city name and the state name, the country as well. So let's jump back over here, take a look at these fields. Okay, and you want to kind of just dig into the API documentation just to make sure you have like a high level understanding of it, of how to correctly pass in the values and the type of response that you're expecting so that you can properly parse it. So just looking at some fields here for the API. Right, latitude, longitude, this is the current weather. This is how we access these values in the response. So we have the current weather.description and current weather.icon. So this is what we should expect back for the description. And they also provide icons as well. So this is what they provide in terms of icons. So these are just the small little thumbnails that give you an indication of the weather. So that looks pretty cool. Okay, now let's add another data model called weather API response. So inside of this weather API response, we actually want to create another class called weather info. So this weather info is where we're going to actually pull in the weather info. So this is where we're going to map the description to the description field, the icon to the icon field. We'll start off by setting them both equal to an empty string. And now we want a class called main info. That's going to be our temperature. And now that we have those two classes, we can create a list of weather info objects. We'll call it weather. Add our getters and setters here. Go ahead and set up our main info class. Add a field called name. Perfect. I think that looks good. Okay, now let's add another data model here. This one will be our weather view model. This is what we can use to display data to the page. So we'll start off with a field for the city name. Then we'll take that city name, we'll pass it into the geocoding API to get the latitude and longitude. And then we'll take the latitude and longitude and we'll pass it into the weather API to get the temperature, to get the description of the weather, and to get an icon representation of the weather as well. Okay, let's hop over here to our weather service. So we'll start off by creating a read-only field for our HTTP client. We'll create a constant to store our API key in. I'll have to remember to go back and add that later. We'll initiate our weather service object by passing in an HTTP client. Let's make sure we add our models folder so we can use our models here. So this will be like the first part of our API call where we're calling geocoding API. So this method is going to return coordinates. We're going to pass in the city, which we're going to get from the user. So let's go over to our geocoding API documentation, and we need to pull this URL here. So this is the URL that we'll use. We'll pass in our city name here, and this is where we'll pass in the API key. So make sure those line up with our variable names. Looks good. Okay. Now we want to pass the actual API call inside of a try-catch block, just in case there are any issues. Okay, so we can decide how to handle errors at a later time, but for now, we'll just return null if an exception is caused. So inside of this try block, we want to create a variable called response, and we will use this to make our API call, and we want to use this response.ensure success status code just to make sure we get a successful response. And if we do, this is the data that we'll get back from the geocoding API. It will be in JSON format. Let's look at this documentation here. Okay, it'll be in JSON format. So we will read the JSON as a string, and the geocoding endpoint actually returns an array with the coordinates. So we just want to make sure we parse that properly. Okay, so once we have the JSON returned as a string, we want to create an array called coords array, or our coordinate array. And we will deserialize this JSON into a list of coordinates or coordinate objects. And we want to make sure that it is not case sensitive. And so if we get anything back, then we just want to return the first item in that coordinate array. And that will essentially be our result. Okay, and so now that method or that API call should return the latitude and longitude. Now we'll use the results from that API call to pass into our weather API. So we'll use doubles for the latitude and longitude. So same thing here, very, very similar. Try catch block. We'll have to go back and paste in our URL, but we want to have a response variable. It's going to make the API call. We'll store the result in a JSON string and then deserialize that string into a weather API response object, and we'll return the result. Plug my catch values back in there. Now let's go back to the one called API. So we don't need to exclude anything, but I do want to make sure I'm using metrics that I'm familiar with. So, all right, so let's paste in what the API call looks like, make sure all of our variables are lined up. We'll get rid of this exclusion parameter here, add the units parameter because we want to use metric units. Make sure this maps to our API key variable, and it does. Latitude, longitude, those are lining up. Looks good. So now let's jump back up here to the controller. We will rename it. Let's call it weather controller. Click yes there, so it'll sort of do our cascading updates. Okay, we can get rid of the default code. And we'll start with a read-only field called weather service. So when we instantiate our controller or initialize our controller, we'll pass in weather service. Now let's add an HTTP GET on top of our index method here. This will just return the view with the weather view model object. And an HTTP post method. And this one will accept the weather view model. Some basic validation here. So for this, we just want to check to make sure a city was entered. So if they don't enter a city, then there's no need to go through trying to call both APIs. So we'll make sure that a value was entered for the city. And if not, then we'll just add a model state error telling the user to please enter a valid city. But if they have entered a city, then the first thing we want to do is get the latitude and longitude from the geocoding API. So we'll pass in the city name into our get coordinates async method that we created in our weather service. And so we'll do some validation here. Just make sure we get a value back from that service, that API call. So if we do not get a value back, if we get a null return, then we'll add a model state error. But if we do get what seems to be valid coordinates, then we want to go ahead and assign those to our latitude and longitude fields on our model. And finally, we want to use the latitude and longitude to actually get the weather. So these are the values that we will pass into our get weather by coordinate async method that we created on the weather service as part of the weather service. And if we do not receive what looks like valid info back, so if we don't get valid info back, we'll just add an error to the model state and return the view as is. But if we do, then we want to populate the weather view model with data. So we'll populate the temperature. And I know this is in degrees, but let's see if it's in Celsius or 292 degrees. That's definitely Celsius. It's either Celsius or hell. All right, so degrees Celsius, and let's also map what we get back in weather.description. And finally, our weather icon here. But let's do a little bit of validation on this one, since this is actually linking out to a URL for a photo. Let's look at the sample. So this is what the URL should look like. So in it, just looking at the name of each icon here. Okay. Let's copy that URL, and it's going to, well, we will drop the icon code inside the URL, and that should give us the thumbnail we're looking for. Okay, so once all of this data is parsed out in our view, we can now pass it out to the user interface. Okay. Now let's use an HTTP GET to return the results. Okay, and now for our weather view, I want to start off by injecting our model here. It's our weather view model. And now let's tweak the title of the page. With a basic header telling the user to enter a city. And now we need to provide a way for them to enter the data and submit it. So we will create a form, we'll link it to our index method on the controller. Now we need a label for the city and an input space for the city, for the user to enter the city. And we need to give them a way to submit the city they've entered. So we'll add a button there. Perfect. Let's just add a little bit of error handling to the page here. So let's check to see if there are any model state errors. Then we'll just do something very generic there, and we can of course come back and update that at any time. Okay, let's add another view here for our weather results. Start by injecting our model. Give our page a title. Simple header. Pass in the name of the city that's being used. Do a little bit of validation here. So if there is a valid latitude and longitude, then we want to show the user the coordinates that we pulled back from the geocoding API. And we also want to do some validation on the data we receive or expect to receive back from the weather API. So we'll start by checking to see if we received any values for the temperature. And if we do, then we just want to display it. If not, then this part will just be skipped over. And we want to do the same thing for the description of the weather. If it's available, we just want to display it. If not, just skip over it. Same thing for the icon. But we'll change from a paragraph tag to an image tag. And the image will be pulled or sourced rather from our icon URL. Give it some alt text for accessibility. And now if the user wants to check another city, we can just link them back to our home page. Take a look at our layout. We can simplify that a bit, but I don't want to get rid of it. Clean up the head here. Get rid of this extra style sheet. Title looks okay. So for the body of the document, we'll add a header, basic header here, weather app. Give it a little divider, a little space there. And then for the actual body of the document, we'll create a div, give it the content class, and then we'll just use the render body method. That way, whatever code we have in the index view or the results view will render in this section. And finally, a footer. We'll give it just a really, really basic footer here. Okay, looks good. Our view imports file looks good. View start looks good. Let's run this and see what we get. Okay, so no web page was found. We get a 404 error. So anytime I see this type of error, especially when I'm running something for the first time, then my first thought is something is off with the routing. Something cannot be found, so something must be broken with the routing. So let's hop over to the program file. Okay, so we added our HTTP client. We've registered our service. Our middleware is there. We're not using authorization. We can get rid of that. Let's look at our routing here. Oh, there's the issue right there. We changed the name of our controller from home controller to weather controller. So let's change it there and rerun it. There we go. Voila. We have an app. Let's see. Let's start by testing it out with Atlanta. Okay, please fix the errors. Okay, because we didn't list out all of our errors, then we'll probably have to run this with some breakpoints set to try to figure out where the issue is coming from. So I'm going to start by narrowing this down by looking at my controller and my service. Set a breakpoint on the API calls, because that is more than likely where the error is coming from. Let's run this again. Try to hit these breakpoints. Okay, so city name, let's enter Atlanta. Okay, we hit the first breakpoint here. And let's take a look at, forgot to add my API key. All right. And you'll see my response code is a 401, which is an unauthorized code. All right, so what I'm going to do is jump into my Open Weather account, and I'm going to pull my API key out of here. So I'll be right back. Let's do that real quick. And then I'll paste it into my API key variable. Okay, so now I've added my API key. Let's try this city again. Okay, let's see. Do we get the coordinates here? There's our API call. And I think I forgot to set the breakpoint. So let's set the breakpoint and try this again. Okay, so our response is okay. Awesome. We got data back for Atlanta. Looks good, looks good, looks good. Okay, let's keep going. We have our latitude and longitude, and now, our weather response call is invalid. Let's see what happened here. Let's make this call again, jump back up to this line of code, and let's run it. Okay, so our response is null. Okay, let's go from the controller to actually diving into the service. Okay, let's take a look at the call inside of the service so we can look at the response. Okay, and so for this one, now we're getting an unauthorized one for our weather API call. Let's make sure it's using the same API key. Okay, our API key has been linked there, but we're getting an unauthorized message. So one of the ways to check it to see if it's your code or if it's an actual issue with the API, which I'm guessing something is going on with the API because we are getting a response back. It's just the response that we're getting is saying that our API is essentially not authorizing us to be able to see the data. So let's just paste this in. So we're going to open up a browser and we're going to basically manually make this API call. We're going to pass in the values that we're passing in. Just see if we can get a little bit more info from the browser. Okay, there's the latitude. Paste that in. There's the longitude. We'll paste that in, and let's paste in my API key. Please note that using one call 3.0 requires a separate subscription. Yeah, no fun. Okay. So apparently this API key is not going to give us access to both the geocoding API as well as like the updated open weather API. So I know there used to be an older version of this API. So what I'm going to do is actually try to make an API call to one of the older URLs. So let me just go in and try to find that documentation really quick. Found it. So basically it's no longer called one call, it was weather. So it was version 2.5/weather. So I'm going to change this in my URL /weather. There we go. And we'll leave everything else the same. Perfect. And it gave me access to it in the browser, so it should definitely give me access to it via the code. All right, so we'll test out using Atlanta again. Okay, so our response for the coordinates looks good. And now when we jump in here, we did get a successful response. And there's our weather for Atlanta. Awesome. Let's try a different city. Let's try New York. Take out these breakpoints here so it can just run. Perfect. Let's check another city. How about Savannah? Awesome. Another city. Honolulu. Okay. Awesome. There's a temperature, there's a description of the weather, and we get our icon or thumbnail picture. So this seems to be working as expected. Perfect. Awesome. This one was a little bit of a doozy, but we definitely were able to get back on track with it. So if you were able to follow along, thanks so much for watching.
And that wraps up our weather app tutorial. Now it's your turn to give it a try. Experiment with more features, try different APIs, or improve the user interface to really make it your own. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, drop a comment with your ideas, and subscribe for more coding projects. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.